Once you have explored lawns and meadows, you're going to find you're entering what we call a ecotone of woods and meadows, that wood-meadow interface or woodland edges. So actually there are several types of locations or habitats that would fit this. Let me go over those. These would be a patchwork mosaic of woodlands and meadows, the small patches of them together. Openings in woods, scattered shrubs or trees in meadows, thickets containing small trees, shrubs, and herbs, and finally shrublands. Now these areas are there because of usually one of four different processes. First of all, human disturbance. There could be mowing, plowing, burning, or bulldozing. Natural disturbance, natural fires, erosion, windfalls, and other sorts of natural small catastrophes. Ecological succession, encroachments of shrubs and trees into meadowlands will bring about this woodland margin of these mosaics. If left undisturbed, this process of succession will actually turn the meadow into a mature forest. And then finally, persistent environmental factors. Now, things like thin soils, excessive drainage, or too much standing water, or too much water, a high water table, will actually prevent a well-developed mature forest forming in an area. So you end up with often sort of a scrubby woodland with openings and sort of these mosaics with the meadows. So without disturbance, you have this interface in areas like that. Now these habitats for the most part are called ecotones. By ecotone we mean a transitional zone in which the environmental factors are intermediate between two adjacent major habitat types. So there is a transition in the conditions from one extreme to the other, and the conditions in that zone will be intermediate between the conditions of either adjacent major ecological type. So this would be, again, in this case, it would be forests and grasslands as the major type, and the interface or the edges will be the ecotone. Now the factors such as sunlight, evaporation, and water availability are going to be intermediate in these areas. Okay? So the plants you have are going to be restricted to the ecotone, restricted to the intermediate values of the environmental factors. Or you may have generalist, ones that are just happen to be there as well as other places. And then finally there will be plants that can tolerate conditions from an adjacent habitat. A good example of that will be the lyre-leaf sage. Now this is actually a plant that is more typical of these ecotones, but we happen to find it in a meadow for photographing. However, if you watch carefully in the video section on the cutleaf geranium, you will notice there are the sage plants in the background in the shade of a thicket. It's more typical habitat. These plants can either tolerate or need partial shade for at least part of the day. Generally, they cannot tolerate bright sunlight all day long. Competition, they're able to compete with the shade of the trees, but they do not compete very well with dense grass growth. Soil requirements, if they're generalist, sort of weedy plants, then the soils won't make much difference to them. But if they are native plants, often the soil acidity and texture will be important. Animal interactions. The animals in these areas are going to be coming either from the meadows or from the forest. So you have deer eating leaves, you have rodents and squirrels eating seeds. You may have grazers coming from the meadow trampling the plants or also eating them. So you have that condition. You also have pollinators coming either from the meadow or from the forest, those coming from the forest would tend to be larger pollinators. So let's look at these particular habitat types a little more closely. Now let's talk about the sort of mosaics of woodland meadow or the actual woodland edges. If the meadow patch is there because of disturbance, human disturbance, such as mowing or plowing, then the soil that is in that spot is basically a forest soil. So you're going to have either a rich soil from a rich woods or a thin rocky soil from what was a rocky woods. The rich woods soil will tend to be more slightly acidic. The rocky woods soil will tend to be either slightly alkaline, or maybe, if not that, then it might be actually strongly acidic. Now, as I said, meadow grasses don't do well under trees, so as a result, in some of these edges, you will find almost bare ground, bare dirt, because the grasses are not under there. Also, the litter doesn't build up as much because wind tends to blow the litter away, unlike inside the forest. So as a result, you are able to find certain mat-forming plants that can't really compete in the grassland. Things like dwarf cinquefoil or dewberry that have runners. Or you may find weak-stemmed plants such as chervil or violets. On the other hand, the meadow patch may be there because the soil is such that it will not support a dense forest. That is, it's either too shallow or it is subject to water flooding it from time to time, some of these conditions. Or it might be too wet for a while and then gets too dry, back and forth like that. That does not support a forest well, or it may be too clay or alkaline. Next are thickets. Now, unless the thickets are there because of these sort of controlling soil factors that prevent a dense forest from moving in, if that's not the case, then the thickets are there primarily because of succession. So for a time, trees from a nearby forest will invade a meadow. So you have basically, first of all, it's probably some shrubs coming in, and then the trees are able to come in and grow over the shrubs. So as a result, you have these patches, or like islands, of shrubby trees and often sort of dense shrubs and coarse herbs all sort of growing together. So that's a thicket. Poison ivy especially likes to grow in that kind of habitat. The area underneath the thicket will not be sort of a nice bare ground like under just scattered trees would be, but instead it tends to be very dense undergrowth. And this is a place that would tend to foster clambering plants such as cleavers and garden veg. And then finally, shrublands. Shrublands are not really that common in the southern Appalachians, except on the heath balls at the high elevation in the mountains. In these heath balls, the plants that you will tend to find that are wildflowers are going to be those that bloom before the leaves come out on the shrubs in the bald, or ones that tend to grow out in more the somewhat more open meadow patches that tend to be rather seepy. Now in the southern Appalachians, other types of shrublands are most likely going to be successional. That is, shrubs have moved into an abandoned field before trees have grown up behind them. So these plants, so in this area, the wildflowers will tend to be more weedy, a lot of annuals, maybe some perennials. So there you have the woodland margins.